Hello, in episode 103 of Airs for Architecture, Aaron Betsky, design critic, former director of the School of Architecture and Design at Virginia Tech, and among many other things, director of the 11th Venice Architecture Biennale, speaks about his recent book, The Monster Leviathan, Anarchitecture, published by MIT Press in January.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Airs for Architecture. I'm privileged to be talking today to Aaron Betsky about Aaron's new book, latest book, The Monster Leviathan, Anarchitecture, published by MIT Press. But before we get into that, Aaron, would you be able to introduce yourself a little more fully than that?
Yeah, I can try to be more fulsome. Hi there, I'm Aaron Betsky. I'm an independent writer, critic, and curator based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Well, that's incredibly short for a storied career like your own.
Oh, I didn't know you wanted me to give my whole biography.
Well, did you study to be an architect? Are you an architect, or have you always been in the world of theory?
Okay, so it's I have a very checkered career in all kinds of ways. I was born in Missoula, Montana, where my parents were professors. At a very young age, we moved to the Netherlands, where I grew up. And misspent my youth in the Netherlands, which is easy to do there. Came back to the United States to study at Yale College. After some doubts, I was enrolled in a special honors program in humanities called History, the Arts and Letters, which was a fabulous program that brought together what they thought were the best and brightest with 4 tenured in different areas for a 3-year march through mainly Western civilization. None of us really achieved much beside one of the people in my class who won an Oscar for doing the music for Oh Brother, Where Art Thou. But when I was getting ready to graduate, I was trying to decide whether I wanted to study art history, architecture, or go into broadcast journalism, which is what I really wanted. I couldn't get a job to save my life and wound up going to architecture school, also at Yale. Upon graduation, after some detours, I wound up working for the architect Frank Gehry in Los Angeles for a few years, for another architect there, Hodgson Fung. Started my own office, went nowhere, and as those things go, I was already doing a lot of writing and some teaching, so then that became the mainstay of what I did. And you know what they say, those who can't teach and those who can't teach Jim. Well, the equivalent of that was that I was called to be a curator at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. And then, of course, those who can't curate become directors. So upon that, I became the director of the Netherlands Architecture Institute, which was at that time the largest architecture museum in the world, and the National Institute for Architecture in the country where I'd grown up. I was then recruited back to the United States to run the Cincinnati Art Museum. Thought I had left architecture behind, but then was also asked to direct the 2008 Venice Architecture Biennale. After 8 years of running the art museum, I went to Taliesin to run the school that Frank Lloyd Wright had started at both the original Taliesin in Spring Green, Wisconsin, and the Winter Home in Scottsdale, Arizona. After I'd done that for 5 years and brought it back into solvency, I was contacted by Virginia Tech asking whether I could take what I had done in the smallest architecture program in the country and do it in the largest. So I moved to Blacksburg, Virginia, which turned out to be a little too isolated for my taste, but also the people who hired me were soon ousted. And so I concentrated on teaching there, and now I'm an independent, as I said, an independent critic and writer, working on a couple of books and other projects. Is that enough?
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I'm really wonderful. I mean, as I say, you're extremely well known within the world of kind of well, the theory of architecture. What was your theme for the 2008 Biennale?
It was called Beyond Buildings,
Okay.
or Beyond Building, sorry. And the idea was that it is very difficult to make architecture with buildings. And so we have to turn towards other means in order to affect the critical activities that we want architecture to be able to achieve, ways to open up our design environment to a more just and situation and open it up to a larger group of people, make it more sustainable, and also make it more beautiful. So it looked at a series of installations and scene settings that went beyond the making of buildings, or at least the creation of finished buildings.
That's a that's a very kind of a controversial comment to say it's very difficult to make architecture with buildings. I mean, obviously that differentiates architecture in some particular way. I mean,
Yes.
and I think that that perhaps undergirds some of this book, the Monster Leviathan.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is an idea that I have been talking about for quite some time now, which is that architecture is not building. Building is building. A building is a building. The act of building is the activity that is involved in making a building. Architecture is everything that is about building. It's how we design building, how we understand building, how we talk about buildings. It is how buildings appear to us. It is, if you will, the meta of building. And so I became very interested in how that metaphorical, or that architecture that goes beyond building, is able to make architecture without just making building. Because the making of buildings is highly constrained, both by all the complex codes that go into the defining of buildings, which are not just building and life safety codes, but also economic and social codes that make it almost impossible to manipulate buildings in such a way as to produce what I call architecture.
Has there been an epoch in which architecture has been possible? Would you say that the Renaissance was a period, for example, in which the building of buildings intersected successfully with?
Well, I'm not, I wouldn't say the Renaissance as a whole,
No.
but certainly those places where architecture has concentrated on what, at least since the end of the 17th century in Western culture, has been defined as its core activity. And we can trace that definition very clearly to the establishment of the Academy of the Beaux-Arts, of the beautiful arts, in its various divisions under Louis XIV. Since that period, the making of architecture has been the creation of the central institutions of the state, and later the making of the central institutions for those who had the money and power within the state, which of course these days is more and more corporations and the people who run them. And so when you work in those situations and for those people, you can make architecture in and through buildings. It is an architecture that always has, does, and always will reaffirm in built form the values of those who are, for whom you're building, which is to say the effective elite.
I mean, that's again another really sort of troubling, I suppose, idea that to a huge extent the identity of architecture is far more bound up with the client, with the money, than it is with the architect themselves. But perhaps we can
Yeah,
come back to that. I mean,
well, absolutely. And the book, The Monster Leviathan, comes out of the two mechanisms that architects then develop in that situation. The first is a kind of psychological transference, where you as an architect have to become the client. And this extends beyond imagining what the client might want and trying to put yourself in their place. to imagining that you are of the same social class and of the same kind as your clients. And so architects have always imagined themselves as gentlemen, and only much more recently as gentlewomen or people of other genders, who live in that world, even though they actually are partially tradespeople and servants of the people in that world. The other technique that architects have developed is to think of what they do in their daily job of helping to produce these kind of buildings as just doing what they have to make money and to perhaps learn more about their trade, whereas their true goal is to build a better world, or later to perhaps warn us of how bad our world might become. And that means that they spend their evenings and weekends, and if they're unemployed, their whole lives, designing utopias or dystopias, other places that they present as what we really need, perhaps after the revolution, or perhaps after their clients have seen the light. And what they build in daily life are at best the building blocks or the promissory notes for that utopian or dystopian world. Of course, when they get the chance to construct aspects of those utopias, either under totalitarian regimes or in situations like the end of the Second World War, when a huge amount of rebuilding had to be done in places like Europe and parts of Asia, they create what are often truly horrific landscapes that prove that utopia is always inherently a kind of dystopia.
I think I've always found this use of the word utopia in a positive light very peculiar, because quite clearly Thomas More did not intend it to be a good idea.
No, it's an other place, not a good place.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So the Monster Leviathan, the book itself, comes out of, I suppose, quite a few years, and you actually state this in the acknowledgements, I think, of your teaching practice. It's a kind of consolidated, almost holistic vision of this other form, this anarchitecture.
Well, I'm not sure it's holistic. I call it a collage or assemblage, and hope it remains that. But yes, when I began to come to this realization, which of course was not a oh my God moment, but I've been developing these ideas over the decades. I began finding in the work of certain architects, but also in the work of philosophers and critics and poets and painters, alternatives to either daily building practices or utopia and dystopia. And those came to be over time at the core of a series of theory classes I taught first at the Southern California Institute of Architecture in Los Angeles in the 1990s, and then later at various places such as the University of Cincinnati and the University of Kentucky, and more recently when I was at the School of Architecture at Taliesin. That really became the basis for this book.
At Taliesin, you obviously deeply imbued in the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, and you start with Wright in this book. This idea of the Monster Leviathan is a direct quote from him. Yes,
and it's actually a remarkable little piece, which I had found way before I wound up at Taliesin. And just to be clear, I did not move to Taliesin because I thought Frank Lloyd Wright was a be-all and end-all. In fact, I was somewhat troubled by his legacy. But the opportunity that he had created for a collective way of learning and making architecture was and remains fascinating, even though the foundation has closed down the school and forced it into exile since I left. But yes, Frank Lloyd Wright wrote this little essay, which is based on the speech he gave at Hull House right after the beginning of the 20th century. And Hull House was a institution in Chicago which sought to enable workers' rights and community activism through education and through support. And Wright, in this little essay, argues, and he certainly wasn't the only one at the time, that we should not reject technology, the world of the Industrial Revolution that had by then engulfed most of the globe and created what was then the fastest growing city in the world, Chicago, but that we should rather figure out how we could make that technology our own. And the argument is an arts and crafts argument. And I've long been interested in the arts and crafts movement, of which Taliesin is very much an example, in its belief that we can build community by taking the possibilities that technology gives us and using it to literally recraft our own environment. And as we speak, as I said, I'm in bathrobe and unshaven this morning because I'm writing my next book, which is on the London group Assemble Studio, which is a design collective that very much carries on in that tradition. And Wright makes that argument, which is quite well phrased and wonderful, though at times somewhat romantic, as Wright was. But then there's this remarkable moment where he stops his reasoned argument and says, quote, "Be uplifted at nightfall," unquote, to where the monster Leviathan, as he calls it, lies outstretched before you. And the monster Leviathan, a reference, of course, to the beast of the Bible, in this version is a kind of Chicago, a image of Chicago as this sprawling industrious city. It's also a factory where production is taking place. It's also a beast, an animal that has flesh and sinews and tendons that he describes. It is also a human being that thinks and acts. And in the end, it is also a printing press. And this wonderful 2-page evocation is one of the most remarkable images of the city, the machine, technology, us as human beings, all rolled into a techno-organic being that he proposes as what he calls at the end the forerunner of democracy. And democracy for him stands for, or stood for him at that time, everything he thought was good about our society, what we should build as communities. So the monster Leviathan becomes for me the image of something that is not utopian or dystopian, but is a kind of mythic other to the environment in which we find ourselves, and maybe even to ourselves, a vision of our world as it may be, if we just look at it in the right way, as it might have been in some mythic, misty past, or as it indeed might be as we continue to build and evolve, both as human beings and as constructed artifacts ourselves. I then go through the book to find other such strange, mythic moments throughout the 20th and into the 21st century.
It's a very nice way of putting it. This notion of the Leviathan that you, and you do evoke it beautifully in the book, as you say, through this, and I stand corrected, this collage-like way of writing in which you're drawing in sources from across the arts and the humanity to create a kind of a tapestry in a way of sources and voices, yeah, which is terrifically evocative. But Wright seems to me to be presenting a wholly new idea, or a challenging idea of the Leviathan, which obviously in the biblical account and then in Thomas Hobbes's account of the Leviathan is not a positive thing, but
No, yeah,
is a thing of threat and of anxiety. Is his intention to sort of, in a way, confront the problematic identity of the modernizing city? Because obviously Upton Sinclair wrote about
yeah,
essentially the same area. In the book The Jungle, he
yeah,
describes the same part of the world as an absolute hellscape.
yeah, yeah.
Is his goal to kind of, in a way, challenge this idea of the Leviathan, this Hobbesian idea of the Leviathan? Or is it sort of like taking the power back from an idea?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that throughout the book, I try to find examples where people have confronted the beauty and the gory glory of the modern environments we have built for ourselves, both in the city and beyond, have confronted the terrible injustice and the incredible waste of resources and the violence that is inherent in these worlds, and not either try to present the polar opposite or glorify that situation, but rather to find the contradictions, the possibilities, the potential within that situation, to really look at the possible rereadings or other understandings of the situations in which we find ourselves. And that's something that in this century has really happened more and more at a kind of local level. We've seen 2 decades now of what has come to be known as either tactical or strategic urbanism, in which architects go to favelas and slums around the world and don't try to fix them, but try to work with them and the people there, what's more important with the people there, to try to figure out what they can become.
Mm.
And that, to me, is part of the direct outcome of these kinds of mythic assemblages that have been created over the last 100 years or so.
Use this phrase in the book, or I get a sense meaning of it, that of this appreciation of modernity through this, I suppose, almost organic analogy of the contemporary the modern city, the modernizing city, as not a thing that can be defined because it is always in a state of becoming.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And in the last chapter of the book, I uh, try to kind of echo what Frank Lloyd Wright was seeing, not in such a grand way, but by looking at such incredible moments of urban confluence as the area around Times Square, which has become quite famous, but also the Strip in Las Vegas, which is perhaps less glamorous or less critically acclaimed in its messiness, and places like Shibuya Crossing in Tokyo, which you might not recognize by its name, but you've probably seen the image of the people crossing in all directions on the main point where adjacent to the train station there. And all these places have the quality of mixing a huge amount of activity, of signage, of built forms, of humanity, and being continually in flux and changing, being incapable of sitting for their portrait, if you will. And to me, that exactly makes them fascinating. But you can also find examples of that in much smaller scales. You know, from the first moment that I arrived in Los Angeles at the beginning of the 1980s, I always felt completely at home there, not because of its supposed glamour, but because there was something so endlessly fascinating about the continual unrolling of the avenues, boulevards, and streets, throughout this sprawling post-metropolis that brings together so much natural beauty and terror with so much human-made beauty and terror into this continually changing assemblage that you can find on every inch of every street corner. And that to me remains what really is at the core of the potential as well as the problems of our environment.
Mm. Before we go on to talk about anarchitecture, this dystopian, utopian framing that architects have periodically done, particularly architects, as you say, who lack work. I wanted to understand a little bit more about this moment that you describe at the beginning of the book again, in the first chapter. Frank Lloyd Wright standing up in Louis Sullivan's office where he trained and looking out, tallest building in America, I think you say, at that moment, looking out across Chicago. And you know, it, as you've beautifully described, it's sort of a moment of sort of horror and delight at the potential and the life in this thing. And you've also mentioned this idea of the arts and crafts, or the craftedness in his work. How does he reconcile these
He
two
doesn't,
things?
and that's the point. And he leaves them hanging, or rather, he leaves them all balled up into this elusive mess,
Mm,
in a kind of what I call anarchitecture in
mm,
that text, and then turns away from them, largely. Though he did propose what to me were some quite interesting experiments at a small level in community building,
mm,
in his own Oak Park area where he lived at the time. And though he did later produce more grander utopian schemes, such as Broadacre City,
mhm.
he basically went on to be a grand architect in the traditional sense. So my story really abandons Wright when he's still a very young man.
Yeah, very, very young. I mean, I was trying to work out how old he was when he gave this talk, but
Yeah, 30, he just, let me think, 67, so 30, early 30s.
shocking. Makes me despair. Past it already. This notion then that you describe, this anarchitecture, could you talk a little bit about where this idea comes from? Who kind of coins the phrase? Because it's an older phrase.
Yeah. The phrase, as far as we know, though I'm sure some PhD scholar somewhere will find deeper roots, was coined by the artist Gordon Muddock Clark, who had been trained as an architect at Cornell University, but who came from this very prominent family of artists, and who went to the then rather bombed out New York scene in the early 1970s to practice a kind of hybrid art making, architecture, community activism. He started a kind of community kitchen and restaurant, even, that focused in the end really on what he called unbuilding, or opening up and destabilizing existing structures. And the phrase was picked up by many people after that, but in particular by the architect Lebbeus Woods in the 1990s. And Lebbeus Woods was an architect fascinated by cybernetics and other theories, who had gone from being a regular designer to being the creator of these other worlds, what he called experimental architecture or anarchitecture, that again reimagined our environment. And for Woods and for Muddock Clark, and then for me, an architecture, first of all, means that it is an architecture, not architecture. And in the English language, there is no such thing as un or the architecture. There's only architecture. If you try to say an architecture, Microsoft Word will slap you on the wrist with their little blue squiggle underneath the two words. Architecture is in and of itself. There is no one particular architecture or possible architectures. And yet an architecture then mushes those two words together to say that there are possible architectures. But of course, there's also an analogous architecture. And there is also an anarchic architecture, an anarchistic architecture, with anarchism being the political movement that comes closest to the arts and crafts tradition in design.
Matter Clark's work is, I think, very inspiring in that respect, isn't it? It sort of prefigures the deconstructivists, which you do get onto in the book.
Mm-hmm.
But I like this idea of the parallel worlds. What are the parallel worlds of the anarchitect imagination? If there's an architecture, there must be an architect. What are they trying to achieve in this? They are simply unpicking the kind of hegemonic idea of modernity, of power.
Yeah, it's the whole point is that unlike architecture, it does not have a result. It does not offer a solution. It does not provide a service. And architecture is a different way of looking, seeing, making, doing, maybe even being, that opens up architecture continually, that evokes architecture, that elaborates architecture, provides analogies to architecture, blows it up. And so the instances that I've tried to collect, and there are many, many more I could have included, are all moments or views or paintings or poems that are that act of unbuilding. There is no final result.
If Lloyd Wright's vision is a starting gun for this investigation, much of the work then that you document in the work of Peter Eisenman and Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, Lebbeus Woods, this comes a long time afterwards. What's the gap about? And what is the event, I suppose, or events that precipitate this? What is the condition specifically that precipitates this? Is it the advance of technology into everyday life? Is it?
Well, that's an interesting question because after Frank Lloyd Wright, I mainly turned in the first few chapters to architects, or to not architects, but to philosophers and critics like Walter Benjamin and Heidegger. But I think that is at least partially because of the both optimism of the 1920s and the possibilities of architecture in that first bloom of high modernism as we now know it, but also the utter devastation that follows in the period of the Depression and then the Second World War. The next bloom of this kind of work indeed comes after that long march towards building a better world peters out with a whimper rather than a bang in the early 1970s, which is when people like Mata Clark are also starting to operate. And both in this book and in some of my other writing, I've talked about 1973 as kind of the year that marks the final end of the last gasp of a revolution is possible, 1968, with the publication of the Club of Rome report, which was the beginning of our realization that we were on a completely unsustainable path, the oil crisis, and the Watergate crisis, and a whole number of other events happening in the same time that really make us realize that progress and the building of a better world is not possible. And that's when various architects and artists and others begin to reimagine again what our world might be like.
And going back to something that you were talking about earlier, this idea, and you mentioned Assemble, this idea of the architect then recognizing the hybridity, fluidity of the modern condition, the modern urban condition, stands back from that idea of themselves as being the people that can answer the question, to rather being actors that intervene in a flow.
Agents, yeah.
Agents.
Actors, agents, yeah, absolutely. And Assemble has taken that, certainly in their early work, very much into a theoretical realm. And in England, part of that way of thinking certainly traces some of its roots, at least, to the work of someone like Anthony Giddens, who had his moment as the favored theoretician of the New Labour movement under Tony Blair, but certainly had a life of his own, who proposes that our goal is to be actors together with our fellow human beings as co-actors on the kind of scene that we want to create for ourselves. And that notion of acting in every sense of that word becomes more and more central, certainly in this century, to how architects see themselves.
In your scanning through of your investigations and analysis of these visions, have you found a kind of coherent line of reasoning in what these anarchitectures are
No,
attempting to achieve?
no, there is no coherence. There certainly are echoes. There certainly are recalls, in some cases very deliberately. There are certainly projects that are continued, and the amount of Mata Clark-esque unbuilding going on now is remarkable. But there is no sense that this is the project, again, because there is no project, there is no end result. What instead you can point to is the way in which some of these images and ideas have infiltrated built work or built environments, all the way from the deconstructivist you mentioned through to the work of the current generation. A lot of my work now looks at what I call imaginative reuse, where people are Mata-Clarking buildings, are opening up buildings and finding ways of re-inhabiting them. And that is a book that I've written for Beacon Press, which will be out this fall.
Excellent. So in this idea, I mean, one of the things that this idea of the utopic visions that they produce, there's also, for me, something of the heterotopic about that Foucaultian idea of creating environments which are distinguished for a certain audience. If you look, I mean, I'm thinking here of the work of Lebbeus Woods or people like Constant, now I'm generally speaking, mispronouncing his name, but I think it's Constant Neuwenhuis, isn't it?
Nieuwenhuis.
There you go. So my poor students, for years, suffering my incredible lack of capacity to pronounce any thing.
Dutch is such a useful language.
But there's this idea, I don't know if I'm right in this interpretation, and I stand to be corrected, but this idea that these utopic visions, these anarchitectures, are about creating, rather than that high modernist thing of creating holistic, totalizing visions. It's about creating small moments of resistance or small moments of perhaps fluctuating identity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I refer in the book to Michel Foucault's famous little essay on heterotopias. When I was all the way at the end of the book, I was thinking I should have made a bigger deal of it. Maybe that deserved its own chapter, although part of the issue is that, like Italo Calvino's Invisible City, it's been perhaps beaten to death by teachers such as ourselves overusing it in architecture. But the point that Foucault makes in this remarkably prescient and very packed little essay is that there are these strange limbo spaces, these threshold spaces, as he calls them, these spaces that offer resistance or inflection or infection of the normative without becoming a stable alternative that can then either be destroyed or appropriated. They are what Henri Lefebvre has called representation null spaces. And they are often outside of the realm of architecture. He talks about things like brothels, and they're also the kind of places that I have talked about in some of my very early work on queer spaces. But they have rarely found themselves until recently into the realm of mainstream architecture, and if so, they sort of have hidden themselves and slipped in through the cracks.
I wonder sometimes whether that notion of this tactical urbanism, these kind of, I suppose, pop-upism, you might call it, ad hocism, pop-upism, has been now co-opted, that its mainstreaming is actually evidence of its co-option into the
Absolutely.
hegemonic system.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I think a lot of young architects I know are no longer so much interested in that pop-upism, because yeah, when pop-ups become Dover Street markets where you have to pay a couple of £100 for the cheapest item, they no longer have a socially critical function, if you will. So the search is continually on for other strange hybrid collages, assemblages of resistance. And yes, you're absolutely right. As Lefebvre says, as soon as you make them, they disappear because they are appropriated. I mentioned my work on queer space. At the end of my book on queer space, written almost 30 years ago now, I talk about how queer space is disappearing. It has become completely assimilated and part of our culture. And the same has happened in the last few decades to a lot of other resistive cultures that have been co-opted into art and architecture. You know, it's remarkable right now that if you were to make a list of the most influential and, to me, most interesting artists working in either England or the UK or the United States, most of them would be Black or of color, and the majority of them would be women or of other genders. And yet, at the same time, the work is now fully already co-opted. So it goes on.
It does indeed go on. I'm very interested. The reason I asked earlier about whether you found a consistent thread in this, and I suppose the heterotopic, the question about heterotopias pertains to that in a way, in that I suppose I was asking whether all of these kind of visionaries have been trying to produce gaps in the system, or at least identify and then occupy them. But I also wondered whether there was a sense in some of these, and I'm thinking here about, say, for example, Bernard Tschumi. You mentioned a beautifully illustrated book, which is really, it's a really lovely book to read through in that respect as well. People like Bernard Tschumi's Parc de la Villette scheme, they're doing something new. Certainly, so they're doing something innovative and critical, but at the same time, to me, perhaps in my reading of it, they're also doing something that is about manufacturing the possibility of an older way of doing society, something that is more integrated, more holistic, and it's obviously an idealism there.
Yeah, I know Chumi's early theoretical work, which is what I talk about a great deal, is very much, for me at least, an example of an architecture. But he then gets a chance, which not many architects do, to install some of those ideas in the Parc de la Villette, when he not only wins a competition, which is, I know, difficult, but relatively easy compared to what comes after that, which is to maintain the kind of critical acuity that the scheme proposed, which was based, first of all, on transference as an idea, but then try to build what he comes to call event architecture as these kind of unstable nodes that are open to possibilities and to forms of resistance. And to a certain extent, he succeeds at that. The problem, of course, is by now the Parc de la Villette is a very polite and very stable place, if you will, but it still has some of that strangeness built into it. And he also held on to some of those possibilities in early projects, such as the Le Fresnoy addition to the art school in northern France. So for me, Tschumi is certainly someone who, in his theoretical writings, but also in his attempts to build, has gone far further than many other architects in sneaking in the ability to sneak in some of this kind of experimental work into the act of building.
Mm. Yes, it's always interesting, and particularly that period of architectural theorizing and those beautiful books, OMA's books, and Shumi's books, and the conceptual work of Zaha Hadid and so on. The realization, I don't know if I'm being naughty in saying this, the realization in their later works, or the abandonment in later works, it always feels very uncomfortable.
Yeah, well, this is a slightly off-topic topic, but certainly there are two levels of that. One is people who just abandon their principles as soon as they start getting the chance to build, like Daniel Libeskind. And then there are people who work to try to install what they believe architecture should and could be doing in built form, and over time have to confront the fact that the built object, first of all, stabilizes and fixes what are meant to be continually critical moments,
Mm.
so that the psychograms of Kolb Himmelblau become this strange monster teetering off the edge of a building in the middle of Vienna in the lawyer's office on Volkerstrasse, and then somehow it's a lawyer's office and it stays the way it was designed and is now itself protected under monument laws. And then firms like Coop Himmelblau or the other ones become very large enterprises with hundreds of people working for them, churning out buildings for the effective elite, for the powers in the state. And that, to a certain extent, is inevitable. But it is also what led me to look at these continual attempts to offer alternatives, to pry open possibilities, to misread or missee our built environment, to find assemblies that have this kind of mythic and unbuildable quality.
So this unbuildable quality, is it then impossible for architecture, as you described it at the beginning, is it impossible for architecture to be realized? Is it always an immanent entity, always slightly out of reach, but because of the nature of procurement, because of the nature of legislation and regulation, and because of the nature of clients, it's never something that we can actually do?
Well, architecture is either immanent as a design, or it's inherent in a building. And I also like to say that buildings become the tomb of architecture. They're buried in buildings, and it's quite often very difficult to find the architecture in the building. An architecture indeed cannot be built. It can be evoked. It can perhaps be performed. It can be described. It is a kind of analogy, but as soon as you build it, you bury it.
Heartbreaking.
Now, which is not to say, so, there was a period during deconstructivism, as you mentioned, when people believed that exactly that act of burying it was where things start, because the building then contains what people like Mark Wigley called the leaky crypt, which emanates a sense of the unheimlich and of other possibilities that can, in a kind of unstable deconstructivist architecture, seep through into the real world.
A sort of creating of an uncanniness as well, which...
Yeah, a ghost. A lot of this has the quality of being a kind of ghost as well, a specter that haunts architecture.
Yeah, that was something that Anthony Vidler was...
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I want to come back to this beautiful image you evoke at the beginning, again, back to Wright, of the architect stood above the city, looking down on the city.
Which is not a city.
Which is not a city.
Well, it's a city, but it's also a factory, a beast, a harbor, a person.
Veins.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I wonder whether these visions that architects have periodically have are unrealizable because of that deportment,
Because of that.
because of that positionality, that idea
Yeah.
that they are in the clouds observing.
It's a very good point. And again, I don't make this maybe as explicit as I should have, but those early anarchitectures bring with them still this notion of the master architect standing above and looking down. You're absolutely right about that. And it is philosophers like Walter Benjamin who explode that view quite literally in what he calls the explosion of the 10th of a second, at least in the earlier English translation. And it's not until after the Second World War that architects begin to come down off of their high horses or their terraces of their skyscrapers and begin to burrow into the messy realities themselves. But you're absolutely right. That is in the beginning, a position that brings with it some of the utopian, dystopian imagery that Wright then later himself works out in projects like Broadacre City.
I want to ask, I suppose, as a final provocation about this idea of the fragmentary nature or the bricolage quality of the contemporary urban experience. How do we square that and the practice of architects in relation to that with some of these demands for the political, social, cultural, environmental demands that we make now? If we sort of step back to the point where either we're co-opted by the man and we're just doing dirty work, consolidating hegemonic power, or we're kind of nerdling around in the gaps and spaces. What is the ethical implication of what we can do as designers?
That you have to find other ways. So we by now realize indeed that the long, slow march through the institutions, as Gramsci proposed, or the sweep to the top on a kind of populist utopian set of ideals, both lead to the co-optation of one's ideas by the existing power structure. One has to keep working. One has to keep imagining. One has to keep analogizing. One has to keep at it. And that means having a life that itself is collage-like and episodic and eschews the kind of quest for the holy grail that will solve all of our problems completely.
Fantastic. What a point to finish on. Thank you so very much, Aaron. That was really wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
There is no such thing as perpetual tranquility of mind, because life itself is but motion, can never be without desire, nor without fear. I don't know, Thomas Hobbes. I just don't know. What I do know is that was a real joy to record, so thank you to Aaron for that, and to MIT Press for the lovely book. Both author and tome are linked in the podcast description. Thanks for listening.